Hello, everybody. I am Lucas from the Blue Fire open source collective, and we're making the Flame game engine. So today I will have a basic presentation about Flame, basically, and what has changed in our V1 version that we released in December. And other people that are in the Blue Fire open source collective is Luan, which was the person that created Flame from the beginning, like 4 or 5 years ago now. And then we have Eric, and we have Henan, and we have Jochum, and we're all in like spread out over the world. Like I'm from Sweden, and then we have Luan, he lives in Canada, and Eric is in Brazil, and then we have Henan that lives in Portugal. So yeah, we're super spread out. Hard to organize meetings, but we're doing quite fine. So let's get started. Start with, what is Flame? Some of you might not have heard of it. It is a 2D game engine for Flutter, and it is the biggest game engine for Flutter, and it is also pretty much the only game engine for Flutter, but we're still the biggest. We have, the game engine is just a Flutter widget, so it can live anywhere inside of your Flutter widget tree, which can be quite handy if you don't want to have like a full screen game. Maybe you just want some part of your app to be a game, or not even a game. You could just need some features that are quite powerful in Flame, like the effects system or something like that. You want to do something cool inside of your app. And we have grown quite a lot lately, especially since we had a co-release at the same time as Flutter 2.8 was released by Google. We released Flame 1.0, and we had a shared article together with them, so we got a lot of publicity from there. So right now we have 2,800 stars and 2,200 commits and 500 forks on GitHub. So, and we're going up at like, I don't know, 100 stars every second week or something. So it's really growing very quickly, and the community is also growing a lot. Like our Discord channels are exploding. And yeah, like I said, we just released version 1 a month ago. So now we have a bit more stable API than we did before. We had the 18 release candidates before we released V1. We thought it was just going to take maybe a few months or so. And we started with release candidates like last October or November, like 2020. But then it ended up taking more than a year because we found so much things that we wanted to change. But now finally we're at a state where we feel we can have a more stable API. Yeah, so just like the widget tree inside of Flutter, like we have a game widget which can live anywhere inside of the widget tree, as I said earlier. And inside of Flame, we're going to talk about this first. And inside of the game widget, you can put any game that extends Flame game, or you can build your own game using the game mixin. But then you pretty much build your own game engine from scratch. You only get a tiny bit of pieces from Flame. But if you extend Flame game, then you will get all the power of Flame. And this is like the boilerplate code for a Flame game. You have your game, and you have an onload method where you load all your assets and stuff, and you add something that we call components. And that is what all of Flame is built around, components. And this is what it would look like then in your main file. You just create an instance of your game, and put that instance into your game widget. And of course, if you have a full-blown Flutter widget tree, this game widget could be anywhere within that tree. So similarly to the Flutter widget tree, we have something called a component tree inside of Flame. And everything that you add to the game is a component. And even the game itself is a component. So you could add a game to a game if you would want to. And this becomes quite powerful, because then you can compose components consisting of different other components. So if you want to have, for example, your player, and you want to have some text or something underneath, or you want to give a weapon to the player, and you can just add components onto that player, and they will follow the player around and get transformed together with the player. And this component tree system, we call it FCS, Flame Component System. And if any of you have done game development before, you might have heard of ECS, which is Entity Component System, which is the most common system like this within game development. But we have FCS, which is quite different. But we also have a package for ECS if you're more comfortable with that, which is called Oxygen. But that one is not as mature as FCS is. And then a very common question that we have is that, can I add my Flutter widgets inside of Flame? And that is currently not possible. It sounds like it would be quite easy to build, but it is quite complicated actually. But what you can do is use our Overlays API. And then you can register your different Flutter components in our Overlays API or on the game widget. And then we can show, you can tell the game that, now I want to show this overlay, or now I want to show that overlay, and now I want to remove these overlays. And then they will just show these widgets on top of Flame, which can be quite handy when you want to use features which are better in Flutter, I would say, like building menus, for example. It's very quick to build in Flutter, but it can be a little bit tedious to build it inside of Flame. And inside of all these components that I have talked about, and inside of the game, we have something called a classic game loop. So for anyone that have done game development before, you've probably heard about this before, but I'll briefly go through it. So in the game loop, you basically have two methods, the update method and the render method. And in update, you get this DT, which is delta time, and that is the time from the last time it ran update. And inside of the update method, you will update all of the logic that has to do with your component or your game, if you're in your game class. And if you want to manually move something, for example, and you have to take DT into consideration, because otherwise, if you run on 120 frames per second instead of 60, for example, your game character would move much faster than it would otherwise, because then this DT will be smaller than otherwise. And in render, all of the render logic is done. So first it does update, and updates all components and all of your manual things to their new state, and then it renders the new state. And then it goes back to update, and it gets a new delta time for how long it was until it last did its update. And so this is what a component, the most basic component could look like. There you have your update method, and you have your render method, and you have the canvas if you want to do any manual canvas operations. But a lot of the time, you don't actually even have to put any logic inside of update or render, because Flame has so many built-in components that you can use that automatically does the update and render logic for you. So you only have to tell it like what it should do, not exactly how it should be done. Yeah, and then you can build this component tree however you want. So here, for example, you have a component, and in onload, you can add another component. You can add a component anywhere. Like if you tap your parent, for example, you could add another component there. But if you want it to add child components directly in the beginning, then you should add them in your onload method. And then as soon as, so we can go back here, for example. How do I go back there? So if when your parent component that has been added to a game gets their update method called, and this is all done automatically, then all of their children update methods will also be called. So it will like traverse through the whole tree and call all the update methods through that component tree, and then call all of the render methods in order. And so you shouldn't do this. Like you should never have to call update or render manually, like because that is always done by the engine, and it takes a lot of other things into consideration that you wouldn't think about. So if you do this, you really have to be certain that you know what you're doing, because usually you don't have to, and if you do it, you will probably end up with weird things happening later. So never just create a component and call update and render manually. Add it to the game or to the component. Like this, like I showed you before. Then we have our one of our like very fundamental components in Flame is called the position component. And every component that moves around on the screen, or like that has a position or a size and a scale and or like is rotated with an angle, those components are position components. So you could, like for example, your player is a position component. If you have a little score thing in the top, that's a position component. But all of those are, or they are extending from position component. There are some other components, but they come from there. Things that are not position components would mostly be things that aren't visible. So say that you have a component that doesn't really do much in the render method, or it doesn't want, you want to manually translate it and do canvas operations with it, then you could extend the basic component thing. But mostly it's position components. And here I have written vector2, that it's position, vector2 scale, vector2 size. Vector2 is just like a tuple that you x and y that you can do different vector operations on. And that comes from a library called Vector Math from Google. But in here, we actually don't, we have a class called notifying vector that is extending this one, which means that you can also listen to it. You can add a listener to it. So if you want from another component, you want to do something if the position or size or scale changes in here, then you can add a listener to this component's position, for example, and then you can react to that in the other component, which can be quite handy. And all of these they're backed by a transformer matrix that is then transforming the canvas and putting your component into the proper state. Right, and we have a lot of different position components. For example, a sprite component, which is just an image basically that you can show in your game. And we have the sprite animation component, which is it's an animation. So if you have, for example, you want your player to run, you have an animation of your player running in a sprite animation component. And we have like a parallax component where you can put several layers as your background, and you can get some form of depth feeling to it. We have a good example of that in the examples.flameengine.org that we will go through later. And we have things like text component, if you want to put the text somewhere on the screen, or whatever you want to do. Shape component, if you want basic shapes drawn on the screen, and yeah, a lot more. Like there is a whole bunch of components, position components in Flame. So this is the basic sprite component that I talked about. Like, say that this is your little pixel art player. It doesn't do much. So usually you don't use just the sprite component if you don't want something to be like static. Maybe this would be a rock or something that is just on the ground that your player can't do anything, but because your player will usually be animated, or your enemies or whatever. So then we have the sprite animation component, and here you can see how it's animated. That it just stands there and breathes or whatever it does. But a lot of the times your player wants to have different states that it can be in. Like here it's resting, for example, but then also you might want it to walk or run. So then we have the sprite animation group component, which is quite a long name, but we felt that it's better to have it descriptive than to have a shorter name that will not be as descriptive. And in the sprite animation group component, you can change the state of your sprite animation, so that now you can see here that when I'm clicking down or tapping down the mouse here, it starts to walk. So then it just swaps the state of that component. And we also have a sprite group component, which is not a sprite animation, but then you can just swap between sprites instead, depending on states, which could be used for example, buttons. You want to have a state that is up, and you want to have a state that is pressed, or things like that. Right, and you almost always want to take input in your game, otherwise it will be a quite strange game, I think. And here we get a lot of help from Flutter, but we have built like wrappers on top of the input system and gesture systems on Flutter. So we have like the tap detector, and so that is just tapping on the screen, for example, or if you're clicking with the mouse, that is also tap. Secondary tap detector, that is like right-clicking on the screen. Double tap detector, quite self-explanatory. Long press detector. Multi-touch tap detector, so you can do cool things with like putting many fingers on the screen if you have some crazy game logic around that. Or a multi-touch drag detector, like you can drag around several fingers on the screen. That one is hard to do if you're using web, or like if you're at a computer, like because you only have one mouse, right? if you're not on some very special system that supports many mouses. And vertical drag detector, like only detecting drags up and down, and same with horizontal. And force press detector, like some screens and such can see how hard you're pressing. And pan detector, that one is a little bit of a confusing name, I feel, but that is like when you just drag your finger around on the screen. Because you don't have to do panning just because you're dragging around your finger on the screen. It is like a drag detector, I would say, but it's called pan detector in Flutter. Because it, kind of like a drag detector. And then the scale detector, so you can make things smaller and bigger. And mouse movement detector, like if if you're doing a game for desktop or for the web, then you might want to have more specific things for when you do mouse movement in the game. And scroll detector, detecting scrolls. And of course, you can detect keyboard events. So these ones you put on your game. But a lot of the time you want to do it on a component level. So you want to only react to input that is affecting your component. So if I click something, for example, then Flame can recognize whether that tap was on top of a component or if it was on the game or whatever. So then only if you have the tappable mixin on your component, then Flame will only send you these tap events if your component has that mixin and that the tap is within the bounds of that component. So then you can react to like on tap cancel, on tap down, and on tap up, and you get some information about where the tap was, etc. And we have similar for for drags. So this is kind of like pans in that one. So if you want to like drag around your component on the screen, then you want to have it draggable, and you want to react to on drag start, on drag update, and maybe on drag end, and change your position depending on how the drag was done. And then we have hoverable, which is for like mouse mostly, that you can it recognizes whether the mouse is on top of the component currently or not, which can be quite useful. And yeah, we can. This is like a lot of text, so it's better I just show you in our excellent examples directory, which is on examples.flameengine.org. I'm just going to see if I can get that tab up. So, and here, this is powered by something called Dashbook, which is also built by Bluefire, or mostly by Eric. And this one is very useful for other things too, if you want to showcase a lot of different widgets, for example. And in here, you see, like, we have lots of different examples. Like every time you do a PR to Flame, which has a new feature in it, it has to have an example in this directory, and it has to have like tests and a documentation. Like that's the basic thing. So that's you will always find a lot of examples here of old and new features. So here we can take an example with here, yes, two basic squares, and if you tap on them, they like move around, but if you tap somewhere else, they don't. Like, so that's something Flame will handle automatically for you. And then we have other inputs also, which are a bit more advanced, like a joystick, for example. You can just react to joystick things. You can style this joystick however you want, and different like buttons, and yeah. And then another thing, I told you I would show you the parallax quickly too. So this is what the parallax would look like. Like the layer in front, it moves the fastest, and the layer in the back moves the slowest. Like, can imagine being on a train or in a car or something, and if you're looking at the horizon, this is what it would look like. And then for version 1 in Flame, we have a whole new effect system, which is very powerful. So you can do, instead of manually handling all these movements and stuff inside of the update loop, you can just apply an effect and it will do it automatically. So these are move effects, for example. So you can see like, this is moving along some path, and this one is having, so every effect can add a controller to it too, which can, so if you see this one, it doesn't move completely linearly. It uses the curve. Inside of Flutter, there is a curves library, or not a library, but it's built in, and you can choose a lot of curves that can change animations. So you can see that it goes a little bit fast in the beginning, and then it slows down, and there's like, I don't know, 50 curves or something to choose from within there, so you can do a lot of different cool things. And we have a lot of different effects to do, yeah, whatever you could possibly want to. And if you want to add your own effect, that is also very simple, because it's very easy to create new effects in the new effect system. Yeah, was there anything more I wanted to show you in here? Let's see. No, we'll probably take that for another time. Let's get the slides back. Wherever those went. There they are. And Flame is also very modular. So if you want other things, you want other libraries that already exist inside of Flutter, either you can use them directly, of course, but we also build something called bridge libraries, which kind of contains wrappers for those libraries, so they will be more easy to use inside of Flame. So for example, we have a physics engine that we have ported, or we have done a bit of the porting work. There has been a massive work from other members of the Dart and Flutter community too, of porting Box 2D to Dart, and that one is called Forge 2D, and it's maintained by us at Bluefire too. And then if you want to use that within Flame, then you can use our bridge library, Flame Forge 2D. And you see the same here. So these big blobs out here, they are the actual libraries. And then we have the bridge libraries here, which provides wrappers to use within Flame. So audio players, for example, is another package that we are maintaining for playing audio and stuff, which you usually want to have in your game. And we have a really cool editor called Fire Atlas, where you can create like sprite sheets and animations. So you can really check that out. It's very nice. You can like run it in the web or whatever, because it's just a Flutter app. And then from those, it can pack down the animations into something called FA file, like Fire Atlas files, and then you can read them from Flame and just directly have them as animations on your screen, which is very handy. And then Oxygen, as I spoke about earlier, which is our entity component system, if you don't want to use the Flame component system. And recently, a work has been started to create an like AI library, like AI in the sense that you usually use in game development. So, for example, you want your enemies to follow the player, or you want them to run away from something, or so that one is called Radiant, but that package isn't done yet, but it looks very promising, and that's built by a community member called Pasha. And we have some other features that I haven't spoken about either yet. And we have a camera and a viewport. So if you want to like move around the camera or like follow your player throughout the world, then you can use the camera and just follow component. And a viewport, if you want to have your game shouldn't give advantages if you have screens of different aspect ratios, for example. So you might want to use a viewport for that, so that you have like a fixed resolution. And we have a collision detection system. And do note that this is only for collision detection. It doesn't, you have to do what should happen when the collision happens. So like if two balls are colliding you have to act on the on collision call, that they should bounce off each other or whatever you want them to do. If you want to have all that like physics thing, then you should use Forge 2D. But usually you don't need the full-blown physics engine, and then the collision detection system is much easier to use. Because then you don't have to use all of the Forge 2D bodies and stuff, if anyone is familiar with the box 2D things. And the effect system I showed you a little bit about, and gesture input handling I also showed you, and sprite batching. If you're doing like, you're rendering lots and lots of sprites, then you want to create a sprite batch so that you don't have to do lots and lots of render calls, but you can do a sprite batch and then do one render call to render all of the sprites, which can be quite powerful. And the physics engine I already mentioned. And if you're having some problems, then you can just, inside of a component, you can set debug mode equals to true. And then when it's rendered, you will see some boxes around it and where its hitboxes are and the positions, and which can be very useful when you're confused why your code isn't working. And if you put that on a component, it will only put the debug mode on that component and its children. And if you put it on the game, it will be on all of the components in the game. Yeah, so how do you get started with Flame? Like I said earlier, you have examples on our examples page, and these links can also be found on flameengine.org if you don't remember them. And we have great documentation at docs.flameengine.org, and we have a short tutorial at tutorials.flameengine.org, and we're developing this page, so it will be more tutorials there later. But it's quite a good way to get started to understand how the Flame component system works and stuff like that. And there are many unofficial tutorials, which you can find a list of them in the Discord, the Flame articles and tutorials channel, I think it's called, and it's pinned. And yeah, what should you do if you get stuck with your Flame game? We have a great community around Flame. So you can like join our Discord and just ask your questions there, and people are very friendly and will answer, and you can discuss how to do different things. And yeah, it's always good to have some people to talk to when you develop. I feel it usually helps a lot. And we have you can always tag something with Flame on Stack Overflow, and we will reply as quick as we can. And yeah, if you want to have it more formal or whatever, or if you want to file a bug, then use the GitHub issues. And yeah, that was all for me. Thanks a lot for having me, FlutterVikings, and I hope to see you in August on the live conference. Yeah, questions?